Welcome to the podcast Scattered, one person's search for the story behind human remains. My name is Yvonne Chorlin. I'm a physical anthropologist and archaeologist. In other words, I like dead people. In this podcast, I explore topics related to dead people, from searching for human remains in forensic contexts to mortuary practices in modern and archaeological contexts, and everything in between. I offer information, perspectives, and insights directly from the mouths of researchers, as well as experiences of people who work with remains. All of this aims to provide you with information on subjects that aren't really talked about, don't seem to be a priority, or they can be very misunderstood. I hope you enjoy. Welcome back to the Scattered Podcast. I am glad that you're here. I am just back from a walk in very snowy and cold Calgary on December 1st, and I'm being reminded of one of my most profound learnings in my osteological training as a biological anthropologist, and that is, if you don't use it, you'll lose it. And I'm being reminded by my hips and my lower back today that I haven't been using them a whole lot. And so they're a little bit weak. I'm in a little bit of discomfort, but not as much as I was a couple days ago when I did my very first barre class. And that's Barre. You know, if you picture a ballet studio and it's that pole that runs across, waist height thereabout in this mirrored room, yeah, that's what that was. And yeah, I'm trying to use my body a bit more because I sit a lot, but that was using my body in ways that it was not accustomed to. It was not a good time. My lower back seized, my neck hurt, and it was just, I had to stop about 20 minutes in and just drop to the floor and get right into child's pose, my poor lower back, and then I had to take drugs later on. So yeah, my body is reminding me that I haven't been using it a whole lot, and so I'm probably losing a bit of strength. In my archaeology days, I used to walk a lot and haul a lot of stuff on my back and be actually quite strong, and I'm not like that anymore. It's a little over 10 years on, and yeah, it's just not happening anymore. So I was really reminded that I am no longer at my archaeology fitness level when Shari and I were down in Lethbridge a couple of years ago, actually Fort McLeod, southern Alberta. And we were with Officer Sonia Stock. Hello, Sonia, if you're listening. And we were setting out some dead pigs for the scavenging study. And unlike all the other times when we had a bunch of burly male officers helping us out, there was just the three of us. And I hate to admit it, but Sonia, I think, did most of the work. We had to haul these pigs, drag them, and these are big pigs. These are like 150 to 250 pound pigs. And well, let me just say that it's easier moving a dead pig in the bush when it's clothed and on a tarp than it is trying to move a naked pig. Strange stories that you have when you're working with dead pigs in the bush. Anyway, that's when I learned that I am no longer at my archaeology fitness level. It used to be that in archaeology, I could actually move an ATV, a quad, jockey it into position on the trailer or the headache rack. And I had a lot of problems moving the pig. So since that day, a couple years ago, 2.5 years ago, I've been really working on my fitness level. And sometimes it's a good day and sometimes it's not. I hope that you are finding ways to use your body so that you don't lose any strength or flexibility and you maintain your youthful vigor and vitality. What else is going on? In Calgary, like I said, we are snowbound and iced up. That happened a couple of weeks ago. We are looking forward to nice sunny temperatures, and I think I might actually be becoming an actual Calgarian because I'm hoping and wishing and waiting for the next Chinook to come in so we can get some plus temperatures and get rid of some of this snow. Today on the podcast, I have an interview with Dave Sweet. He's a retired homicide detective, and I hope you'll stick around for that. As usual, if you find this podcast and the information in it useful, please do consider supporting the podcast by donating. It would make my year. I mean, there's not a whole lot left of this year, but it would make my whole of 2025. Just, you know what? $1, $5, $10. It doesn't matter. Anything. And this money goes directly to me to support my time making the podcast and also to help to do the research that you hear about on this podcast. My time on the podcast is significant. I do a lot of cold calling. I do all the post-production as well, all the editing. And I spend a lot of time reading journal articles. I've got a pile on my desk right now awaiting to be read. And I am not an adjunct professor anywhere. I don't get paid for doing research. I don't get paid for doing the podcast, except from you. So please do consider supporting the podcast by buying me a coffee or becoming a Patreon member. If you want to ask me a question, you most certainly can. I would love to hear from you. Bring me all your burning archaeology questions or your biological archaeology questions. And you can reach me through my website, yvonnecharlin.com, or you can email me at ykjorlien@gmail.com, or you can contact me through my Facebook page, Reluctant Archaeologist. Reach out and tell me what you think of the show and what you're learning about dead people. All right, well, we'll see how it goes. So why don't you start by telling me who you are and what you're currently doing?
Sure. So my name's Dave Sweet, and I am a retired detective from a large Western Canadian police service. And currently I am working as a consultant in Calgary. Do a lot of workshops, training, write books, have my own podcast. So I'm a sort of a jack of all trades as it stands right now.
Your own podcast? What?
Yes.
How did I miss that?
Yeah.
I'm going to have to go stalk you now and look you up. What?
Yeah.
So how long have you been retired now?
I actually just retired last year in October. So I'm just coming up on my 1 year anniversary of that. But I'm still a young man, so I feel like I can't be too idle. I haven't earned that yet.
Right. So. Well, thank you again for agreeing to speak with me. I've been trying to find somebody or some way to address talking with the next of kin and working with them regarding their either potentially or actual dead relatives. And I've always felt very iffy about approaching families to talk about that sort of thing because it's icky to go and say, do you want to, talk about how you're feeling? Because I just find that very insensitive. So thank you for coming on and agreeing to talk about this very touchy, sensitive subject.
Sure. And I think, I recognize it as sensitive as well, but also I think hopefully it will be some valuable information for people out there, just in terms of when they're dealing with their own crisis and tragedy into the future. We'll all have one at some point in time. So learning a little bit about how other families or how other people have approached that may help somebody listening have a better idea on how they might approach their own.
So let's go back into your past a little bit and if you can, maybe sketch out maybe some situations in where you've had to deal with families and talk to them about their next of kin or, either a potential deceased or somebody who's actually deceased.
Sure. Yeah, of course. So, my background really, I spent the last 14 and a half years of my life investigating murders, suspicious deaths. Uh, and obviously, as a result of that, had um, the opportunity to speak many different families along the way, and including having um, the opportunity to be the first person to advise them when a loved one had died, uh, often in tragic circumstances and situations. And something I think came to learn early on. Well, there's a few things I came to learn early on when it came to um, notifying somebody that a loved one had passed. Was one, make sure that when you went to do the notification that you had some facts, some information that you'd be able to pass on to them, because there's going to be an immediate need on their end to understand kind of what has happened. And although you may not be able to know, you may not have all of the information available, you should be able to at least explain um, a little bit around the circumstance. The second was to keep it truthful and honest always, never to um, sort of sugarcoat an issue, uh, but to instead, be deliberate in the words and the message that you were giving. And that kind of leads into the next part, which was be direct in your message specifically. And what I mean by that is that you can find yourself in a really awkward spot if delivering the news of someone's sudden loss, you used words like they've gone to a better place, or they're no longer here with us. Those types of phrases or messages often uh, followed with some really, really sort of uncomfortable questions like, what do you mean? Where did they go? Or um, and then you would still have to get to the place where you probably didn't really want to be in the first place, which is being just completely direct and honest with them. And so I found early on, learning from others that I'd really watched do it themselves, that delivery could be done compassionately, but it should be always done directly. And so you almost created a script, I guess, of sorts that I used almost every time. We've all had this experience, I think, where we have, we're looking at the clock and we're thinking, geez, my loved one isn't home yet. And it's weird that I haven't heard from them. And if a few hours go by, doubt starts to creep into our minds on like, where are they? What could be happening? And undoubtedly, at some point in time, some of us, our thoughts might even switch to, I hope they're okay, And what would it be like if a police officer was to pull up to my home right now, and we start to kind of pay a little bit more attention to the doorbell, the phone ring, the front of the street, our driveway, as we wait to see our loved one home and hope that everything's going to be okay. Well, from my experience, often the delivery of bad news, it was already somewhat expected from families. And so one thing I came to learn was early on is that if somebody hadn't, they woke up in the morning and their son or daughter wasn't home yet, they began to worry. By 11 o'clock and they haven't been able to reach them, they began to really worry. So by the time you show up at the house at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, their worst fear is coming true. But I think they've actually already gone through a process where they began to sort of rehearse what that is going to look like. And so something I came to learn is honor whatever that rehearsal is supposed to look like for them. They've kind of already decided how they would want the delivery of tragic news given to them. What would happen if the police officer knocked on the door? Would I let him in? Would I make him tea? Would I want to know at the door? What would my reaction be to the news in the first place? And I think as an investigator, when we walk up to a door and knock on it, we have to recognize that somebody's already kind of started has already began to go through that rehearsal. And so really, they're going to tell you how they want the news delivered. So I'll give you an example of it. Years ago, I'd done a notification. A young man, a young father actually, had gone out with a group of friends, and they were enjoying the night. He had left his wife and his kidlets at home, and in the course of the night, they had found themselves at a house party, I guess. And while they're at the house party, there was an altercation, and in that altercation, he was actually fatally stabbed. And so our unit was called out. We learned who he was and learned where he lived and learned a little bit about his history and his life. And I was tasked with another officer of going to the home and notifying his wife of his death. And I remember when we pulled up that morning, it was about 11 o'clock, and she was doing exactly what I had just described. She'd been kind of keeping an eye on the front street, waiting to see who was going to show up. And oh my God, that looks like a couple detectives in a detective car that's just pulled up in front of my house. And I remember as we were walking up the front steps to the home, she comes right out of the house and she stops right on the front step. And I introduced myself. She goes, "I know exactly who you are." I said, she goes, "I think I know why you're here. Does it have to do with my husband?" And I said, "Yes. Can we come in?" And she said, "Absolutely not. You cannot come in." And I said, "Okay." She said, "Is he dead?" And I said, "Yes, he is dead." And I said, "Are you sure you don't want us to come in?" She goes, "You can't come in. My son is having his birthday this morning, and we have a whole bunch
Oh,
of
wow.
kids over to the house, and we are not going to come in and ruin that for him today." So she had a short conversation without us out there on the stoop, and then asked us to leave, which we did, and asked us to come back the next day. And we would do the actual delivery of the news to everyone in the home, including the children. And that's exactly what we did. But she had already scripted out this is how she wanted this to be done for that particular, for her family. She felt that was the right decision to be made. And so that's what I mean by people have kind of already scripted it by the time we've even gotten there. And so you have to be very, you have to kind of improvise off of what they're telling you they need from you at that moment in time. Because I say, in a lot of cases, by the time we've shown up, some time has gone by, worry is already set in, and then we're just the confirmation of what they think may have happened, which is that their loved one has died. And so that was just sort of some of the things I took away from the notification process when it came from families. And depending on how the notification went, those first few words out of an officer's mouth, out of my mouth, we're going to put a family on one of two directions. One, they were not going to be able to get past the sort of the trauma, that initial notification experience, or the notification itself could be the catalyst to already putting people on a path where they are going to get not past it, but be able to put them on a path where you give them a greater chance of being able to heal from the horrible news that they're about ready to hear. You can imagine it could go one of two ways. If the officer that shows up there is aloof, doesn't know a lot, stumbles over the victim's name, doesn't use direct language, leaves things innocuous in terms of what has actually occurred, how difficult that will be for the family going forward. They're going to play that whole scenario over in their mind. It just adds to the trauma. Versus you have an officer that shows up at the door and they're professional, they're clear in their message, they're compassionate, and they follow the script that person wants them to follow. You put them on a much closer path to healing early on. And so the notification process is a huge part, of, well, I won't say my daily duties, but certainly my weekly duties while I spent that time in homicide.
Were you given any guidance or training in how to do a notification?
Over the years, they started to put together um, courses, I guess, that would help prepare officers on how to do it. But no, in those early years, no, it was sort of all based around experience and the experience of watching other officers do it. It's actually interesting because the script that I used was one that was taught to me when I was just a little baby police officer in a uniform. And it was the same script that my officer coach used that I then adopted and then just kind of built on over time with experience. Now, not every notification, of course, goes well. And you can do all of your best, but people go through notifications in different ways. Some are just completely grief stricken and they can't get the words out. Others kind of almost go into a shock and can't get the words out, but are void of emotion. And then other people become extremely volatile and emotional and can demand that you leave or get out of my house or throw a shoe at you or take a swing at you. These are all things that have happened, not just necessarily to me, but to other members that I had worked with over the years. And every notification was a little bit different, but again, it always came back to sort of recognizing people's needs and that every victim and every victim family is a little bit different as well.
So if like watching TV and, the detective says, they didn't, the person on the receiving end of the notification didn't react the way that they thought that they should react. And, the storyline says that that's indicative of something.
Sure.
That's probably not quite accurate then.
I would agree. I would agree with that. I would agree that it probably not too accurate because we have as people so many different individual responses to something so traumatic that I don't think you can look at one response and say that qualifies as being more genuine or honest than another response. Like I said, I remember once going to a home of a woman whose barely 20-something son had been killed at a house party in sort of a beating and stabbing. And when we went to the home, she was so sweet. She was so kind. And she brought us in and she wanted to make tea first. And so sat on the couch and sort of made some small talk with her. She prepared the tea and then sat down. And we delivered the news and she just stared straight ahead. She just absorbed it, but said nothing and was completely, really void of, I would say, any emotion. And I remember putting my hand out. I kind of would just, I don't offer it into somebody else's hand, but I would always like kind of leave my hands open just so that if somebody wanted to, they could hold it. And but I let them kind of come into my space versus me going into their space. But she took the opportunity to grab my hand, and I remember just kind of holding my hand and cupping it and just kind of staring straight off into the universe. And she just held it probably for 10, 15 minutes. She didn't cry, she didn't do anything, she just held it. And I would say that that was a really unusual reaction. But I would also say that um, it's a reaction of grief no differently than a person who falls to the floor and begins to wail, which also sometimes happened. Culturally, people are different as well in terms of the way they react. Some cultures, wailing and being very, very open about their grief is more commonplace than sort of shutting in like she did, right? And so you have to be prepared for that as well. Yeah.
It sounds like empathy and, like you say, improvisation are two key elements when you go to notify somebody. Do you find that there are perhaps some people that are better suited to deliver a notification than others because they have more empathy or improv skills?
I do actually. Yeah, I do feel that way. Um, yeah, like in anything, it's a skill set that some people are really, really great at, you know, some aspect of police work. And then others are better at a different aspect, like notifications. I think the ones that are um, skilled at delivering difficult news are ones that are not afraid to again use that kind of direct language, find a way to be able to use it in such a way that still comes across as compassionate and empathetic. And um, one thing that I often speak about is one of the greatest aha moments I ever had as a police officer was learning the difference between sympathy and empathy and how uniquely different those two things are. Breanne Brown, I'm not sure if you're familiar with her, but
Yeah.
she really has this thing nailed, this concept nailed. She talks about sympathy as being a real disconnecting or separating um, action, while empathy is a very connecting action. And in her analogies that I've seen her do in the past, one of them is that, if you have a friend you're walking down the street and you come across a friend who's fallen in a hole, a sympathetic person will walk to the edge of that hole, look down and say, "Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry to see that you've fallen down the hole. Do you need any help?" And because you're practicing sympathy, the friend that's fallen in the hole is likely going to say, "No, I'm okay. I'll figure it out." Because you've kind of disconnected in that display of "I am sorry," which are sort of the three words to a sympathetic reaction to somebody else's tragedy. "I am sorry," but they're the three most common words that we use. My condolences. I'm sincerely sorry. I am sorry. These are all forms of sympathy. The empathetic person in that same situation is walking down the street and they come across their friend who has fallen down the hole. The first thing they will do is acknowledge that their friend has fallen down the hole. They might say something like, "Oh my, you must be so scared. I see you falling down that hole right now. You look cold. Give me 1 minute. I'll be right back." They leave the edge of the hole, get a ladder, come back with the ladder, stick it at the end of or at the edge of the hole, climb down, and then help that person up, and then they climb up with them. right? That's empathy. And empathy is really about that. It's about getting into the hole with somebody, to kind of move through that with them. It requires vulnerability. And that's why it's so connecting, because there will be an exchange there. I'm going to come into the same hole as you. I'm going to make myself vulnerable so I can be with you. And then we're going to climb out of this together. That is very connecting. And so, how does this all matter when it comes to things like notification? I think when we can practice more empathetic responses and try and stay away from, I'm so sorry for your loss. And instead, I don't know what you must be going through right now, but if I can do anything for you, call a friend, call a family member, sit here and hold your hand. You're my priority right now. And I don't want to leave you until I know you're going to be okay. That's different than saying, I'm sorry for your loss. Right. And so that skill set, it takes time to hone it and it takes time to sharpen it. But once you're able to start to use empathy, whether it's a notification or any other interaction in your life, it's a game changer when it comes to relationships. You could save a marriage once you figure out empathy is different than sympathy, right? And so you could save your marriage. I'm
Here we
sorry, honey.
go. Marriage advice on this podcast. I never thought
Yeah,
I'd
there
hear
you
it.
go. I'm sorry, honey, that the baby was crying all day versus I can't imagine. I know how frustrating it is for the baby to cry. When I get home today, I'm going to give you the much needed break you need. And I'm going to take little Johnny with me and we're going to go for a walk. That's different than saying, I'm sorry the baby was so colicky today. You know what I mean? So we can start to practice that, and we can do that in all aspects of our life. You don't have to be doing it in a tragic situation to create that connecting response. Yeah.
So that's notification for a deceased. How does that differ if, for a missing person, when there isn't that, kind of that ending? How do you deal with that?
Uh, well, I think everybody would have, again, sort of a different view on that. And I mean, I respect all of them. I think for myself, if I was, so typically we don't do the notification on the missing person because it's usually the family member that you would notify
Mhm.
has reported that individual missing in the first place. So the notification, like they're the ones notifying us that this individual's missing, right? But there is going to be a process that is going to still occur where over the course of a period of time, that individual isn't just going to be missing, but that they're, in some instances, not on all, but in some instances, evidence starts being collected in the course of that investigation, which starts to lead to a more ominous result of why they may have gone missing. And that's when, I won't call it so much a notification, but it requires a lot of communication with the missing person's family to get them to start to realize that this may not have the fairy tale happy ending. And that just requires, again, a lot of empathy, a lot of listening, and a lot of inquiry where you will start to message that things may not be quite so well. It might start with, you know, in a case like Bob's, sometimes uh, we start to collect evidence, and sometimes in the course of collecting the evidence, we start to become more and more concerned about Bob's well-being. I feel that specifically as it relates to Bob at this point in time, we are starting to collect some evidence that is causing me some concern, right? we won't actually know until we find Bob what happened to Bob, but you can start to sort of lay out that messaging. What do you think happened to Bob? You're his mom. What do you think happened to Bob?
Mm.
Oh, well, I think Bob might be gone. A mother always knows these things. You may not be wrong. How are we going to prepare for that as if that's a possibility into the future? Do you have family? Do you need family to start to come be around and support you? We're going to work our very best to try and figure out what happened to Bob and figure out where Bob might be. But in the interim, do you have a support system around you? Right? On the chance that your intuition as a mother isn't wrong and that we do find Bob deceased. So that's kind of where it changes a little bit. I think it's a little bit more of putting a person, again, it's a lot of it's messaging, but putting a person on a path where they start to identify what the conclusion could potentially be, right? Just through how you explain things. It would be completely irresponsible for an investigator to come in and promise somebody something like, I promise we're going to find Bob.
Right. Yeah.
I think that would be something that would be terribly damaging to the family, because it would, I don't think in any of these scenarios, I don't think it's our job to destroy hope, but I also don't think it's our job to create false hopes either. I think it's our job to be very realistic and always kind of keep people mindful that all possibilities exist until the investigation is completed or until Bob is found.
Do you think that there is such a thing as closure?
Closure. Well, I guess it depends on in what way. Like if what was important in a missing persons case, for example, was that the discovery of their loved one's remains and those remains are discovered, then I guess from that perspective, there's some closure. If that's what that was the most important thing. If a family feels that closure comes by way of some sort of form of justice, I would say the jury's out on that. I've found very few families in my career who felt like a sentence imposed against an offender that's done something horrific to their loved one was the just and fair decision or fair result. Very few families go, you know what? They got it right on that. Yeah, he only deserved 15 years for the murder of my daughter, right? It doesn't usually happen that way. I always used to remind families, though, that the decision that occurs in a courtroom and then the sentence that follows, it's sort of a cruel reality, but the sentence isn't for the victim or the victim's family. The sentence is imposed for the offender and for the community that offender will one day likely return to. And so no sentence imposed will be probably good enough. I remember I used to have this conversation with families before a sentencing where I'd say, a number is a number and it doesn't represent the love or the life lived of the person you've lost. If the decision is made that the sentence reflects it's a 10-year sentence, you will wonder why it wasn't 15. If the judge came back and said it was 15, you would wonder why it wasn't 25. If the judge came back and said life forever and ever and ever, you'd want to know why it wasn't death. If the judge had said death by way of lethal injection, you would want to know why it wasn't death by multiple stab wounds, like they took my own. Like, where does it stop? And so families that can resist that sort of going through that process usually do a little bit better on the other end when they can separate out the process to the loss. When they equate the loss to, say, a number, I think they have the tendency to stay angrier for longer, which is totally a natural response. But those that can find the strength not to do that, I think they actually, in the end, probably do a little bit better, just based on my own experience, in terms of being able to not close it off, but to switch the focus of the loss onto something maybe a little bit more positive, like a legacy, for example, a foundation, an organization, a scholarship in their loved one's name. Yeah.
Yeah, the reason I asked is there's always, I think, this expectation that, yeah, once you've found your missing person and either they're alive or they're dead, or you found the remains, that ending provides closure, or going to trial, the person being found guilty gives closure. There's always some perceived endpoint that is going to give me this miraculous closure, this
Mm.
fabled thing. And I've heard some families say that, you know what? No, I never did feel the closure. You get all those endpoints and there's still no closure.
I actually understand that perspective because even as an investigator, you've put all these hours, months, maybe years into an investigation or into a case. To hear the proverbial gavel drop and the determination of guilt come through, you think inside you would be like rejoicing, but you're not. You find that experience very anticlimactic. Like you knew it was going to be that way, but it wasn't like it didn't make you feel the way you thought it was going to make you feel. You once you get to that point and the gavel drops, you think inside you're going to be like, yes, all my hard work has got us to this point. But it never felt that way for me, anyways. I didn't look at it and cheer out loud or any of those things. And it just felt like the decision was made, but it was never quite as joyful or as exciting as what you thought it might be, I guess. And I think for families, yeah, I don't think, especially when it comes to missing, well, if a person's gone missing, and let's just say it takes a year before their remains are found, and by the time they're found, it's not intact remains. Let's say they were found in the woods or wherever, and they're not intact anymore. There'll still not be closure. There'll be closure on the fact that we can now prove positively say through the skillful expertise of our anthropologists and people like that, we'll be able to say, yes, we know who this individual is, but there wasn't enough information left behind with their remains to tell us exactly what happened to them. And so, yeah, you've discovered that their fate being that they died, but there may never be enough information available to tell you how they died or if somebody was involved in it. So, yeah, you get a closure on one end. You're no longer looking for them in a crowd. Sometimes people, they do that, when they've lost somebody or somebody is missing, they can spend years looking in crowds for them. And I had a friend that talked a little bit about that with me from a personal experience where after her father had passed away. She used to just look, she couldn't believe that he had died. And she used to look for him all the time in crowds, hoping that he'd be there. And she never saw him, of course. But I think that experience is probably tenfold for somebody that's has a loved one that's gone missing. And so now we found them, but there's still a lot of things that need to be explained. So you've closed off one thing, but then you're on to the next thing. And then once we get to the next thing, which is maybe we identify that we do know how they died and we know who's responsible for their death, then will the court case provide us closure? Well, it may or may not. Does a guilty verdict or a guilty plea give a family closure? Well, maybe some families, but maybe it's the sentence is the next thing you move on to. That's what I say by, I don't know if there's ever a complete closure on any of these things. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It's sounds like a bit of a roller coaster of expectations, unfulfilled expectations.
I feel that, yeah, it's such a great way of saying it. And I agree with you. I think it probably is for a lot of families. Yeah.
Um, the the remains that you brought up, when remains are not intact, and they've maybe been out in the woods for a bit, or in the water,
Hmm.
um, and you know y- the investigation has done as much as it can with the remains to figure out who the individual is, what happened to them, etc., and you're now ready to turn them over, release them to the family. In your experience, how do people deal with not having an intact relative?
Mm. Honestly, we almost start to venture a little bit out of my wheelhouse. I feel like that would be, unless somebody actually expressed it to me, and I guess a couple families have over the years. Uh,
Do you ever get anybody that says, you should have tried more, you should have looked more, you should have
oh,
done
yeah.
more?
I mean, I've never had it to. Um, I the short answer is I don't know that I've had that happen in one of my investigations, but I've
Okay.
seen it happen to other investigators, right?
Okay.
Where we've recovered partial remains. There's been a great effort to try and recover the rest of the remains, but we're unsuccessful. Maybe they've gone to a landfill or something like that. So we'll be able to recover some, but not all. I mean, that obviously leaves people with a terrible sense that the body has not been returned to them intact. And they might become frustrated with the police. I actually saw this play out. We just saw this play out not that long ago, I think, in Manitoba. I don't know if it was in Winnipeg but
All
they're,
right. Yeah.
and you feel for those families, and I understand their grief. Well, how can I even say I understand their grief? I've heard their perspective before. I've never been in the situation where I can understand their grief, but I've heard their perspective, and it's certainly shared in a natural perspective. But I've also look at it on the other side of it and realize how this doesn't mean that you don't try, but how daunting a task that would have been, you know, um, with such a low probability of result, such a low
Right.
probability of result. And I have uh, been part of cases similar to that, where we recovered some of the remains, but weren't able to recover all of them. Despite everyone's best efforts, at some point in time, you just have to say that it's just not going to happen, right? It's landfill. Landfills are a great example of that, just because the
Right.
vastness of a landfill, like you don't think that they're that big until you're out there standing on a pile of garbage that's however many feet deep. And,
It's the depth. Yeah.
it's the depth and the kilometers around. Like you don't,
Yeah.
there's not necessarily a way of knowing exactly where garbage was deposited or dropped. So this becomes very much the proverbial needle in a haystack. And I do think that um, we have to try, but I also recognize that it's extremely limited. At some point in time, you also have to know when to fold them. Yeah, and that would be a difficult conversation to have with a family. Yeah,
Yeah. Again, that roller coaster ride of expectations.
that's right. Yeah,
Yeah.
but I think depending on how it's approached from the beginning, it could potentially help a little bit with people understanding that, right? Like if it was just
Mhm.
again, it comes back to that messaging and making sure people that expectations are outlined early, and that and I'm not saying that they're not in these cases, but I do think that expectations and managing them are very, very important part, especially in those early days of any investigation. Yeah.
Right. Well, let's finish on a happier note.
This wasn't happy. This is strange.
Tell me about your podcast, Dave.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So it just was something that I wanted to do. I kind of alluded to it earlier when I was talking about families, and they're like, their need to, or I think something families can do when they're going through tragedies and things is to like kind of look outside of the things that aren't in their control, like sentences and that, and to start to focus more on legacy. And so one of the things I thought would be important for myself, anyways, was to have just a little podcast that would capture my thoughts and my voice and my face, so that one day a great grandchild that I may never know may be able to watch it and say, the way he thinks or the way he says certain things, or I've got his nose, or I've got his hands, that they'd be able to find some familiarity. So the podcast was really sort of part of a continued effort on my part to leave a bit of a legacy on this earth, because I certainly know that tomorrow is not promised to any of us. And so my podcast is called The Ride Along, and it's a feel-good true crime podcast. It's very much themed in around some of the things we talked about today. It sort of follows that same kind of theme, where hopefully it doesn't leave people with too much of a heaviness, and maybe some validation on what we can do to live better lives, and learn a little bit about what happens when tragedies are a teacher, and how we can respond to that and take positive takeaways from it. So that's what it's called. It's called The Ride Along. It's with me and my co-host, Nicole McKay. And you can find it on Apple, and Spotify, and YouTube as well. So
Nice. And you've also got a website. Isn't that correct?
I do. So my website is can be found at www.unconventionalclassroom.ca. And there you can learn a little bit about some of the workshops and training opportunities I provide, as well as some of the other services that I give as well.
Fabulous. Well, thank you very much, Dave. This has been enlightening, informative, insightful. It's
Oh,
everything that I wanted to talk about with
great.
yeah, in regards to this topic, but without the ick that I was
Yeah.
really trying to avoid. All the sensitivity, but with none of the ick. So thank
Yeah.
you.
And, I hope it helps somebody out there, and somebody's going through a tough time. Like there are people that are out there that will help you. You just need to reach out to them, and hopefully you have a supportive friend in your life or a supportive family member. But if you don't, victim services, most police agencies across this country have them. And they're also great ways of being able to help you through your grief, loss. Hopefully nobody is there and is ever part of this exclusive, horrible club that a few families every year have to become part of. But if you are, just know there are people out there that will help you. Yeah.
Right. I hope you've enjoyed listening to this episode. Please leave a rating or review and share this episode and podcast with your friends, family, and colleagues.